Hi everyone, I'm Barb Howe. I'm an instructor at the University of South Florida in Tampa. This is a video on how to analyze an argument for my POT 4036 students, Democracy and Propaganda. This is an advanced political theory class for undergraduates, but really anyone can use this video if you want a refresher on how to analyze parts of an argument. It is election season after all, so there are lots of good and bad arguments out there to analyze. I will be speaking generally about the different parts of an argument, but my examples will come from the assigned reading for week 2 of my class, which is an article by David Kamens on the recent rise of populism. This video covers only the first part of analyzing an argument, but it is the most important part, which is identifying the key parts of the argument, such as propositions and assumptions. Possibly I'll make a second video later, but we're going to start out with this because you can't analyze an argument unless you can identify first the parts of the argument. So let's just jump right in. Okay, the good news is the first step is pretty easy. The first thing you want to do when you're going to analyze an argument is to identify what the basic question is that the author is trying to answer or shed light on, and then what is their answer. Sometimes the author will state it explicitly and say, this is my research question, but more often than not in the social sciences, they won't say it that way, but they will spend a few paragraphs or maybe the entire first chapter of a book describing an issue and describing why it's a problem. In this case, in the Kamens article, the author spends at least a couple of pages just describing what's going on with the current rise of populism and explaining why that's a problem. Okay, and then the other thing that you want to have is an idea of is what is their short version, what's their answer to that problem. Sometimes they will provide it in the beginning, like at the end of the introduction in like a single sentence, but sometimes not. Sometimes it won't really become clear to you until you read the whole thing. It just depends on the article. But those two things are usually the very first places you want to start when you're analyzing an argument. What is the question that the author is trying to shed light on? And what is a brief version of their answer? Okay. So after you have identified what you think are the author's main questions and answers, the next thing you want to do is to identify the propositions of the argument. How do they get to that answer? So that's what I'm going to talk about on the next slide. Okay, so what's a proposition? A proposition is simply a statement or a claim made in an argument. And if you think about that a minute, you're going to be like, oh wait, aren't there just about anything can be a proposition? And yeah, that is correct. The conclusion is a proposition. A statement of the problem itself, that is a proposition. So in all of the propositions that exist within an article or a book chapter, or whatever it is that you're reading, of all of the propositions that exist within that thing, how do you know which ones are the main ones? Yeah, so that's where it gets a little bit tricky. Identifying the main ones are important because how you disagree with an argument is to disagree with the propositions, right? So I have here a list of 4 things that you can look out for that can help you a little bit. Now, none of these are always going to be true all of the time, but these are some things you can fall back on if you're not sure. One, obviously the author spends a lot of time talking about something. Like you notice they're going on for pages and pages and they're making the same point. Probably they're not doing it that clumsily, but that's an indication that that may be a major proposition of their argument. The second thing could be that the author has a lot of evidence in this section. So you're reading through the article and you're noticing that they're citing a lot of evidence. That could be an indication that they're citing all of that evidence for a reason. So the reason is the point that the evidence is in support of is their main proposition, not the evidence itself. The point that the evidence is intending to back up is one of the main propositions of the argument. Another clue could be when they give examples to clarify something. Sometimes those can be for details, but often it depends on how big it is. If they give multiple examples, that could be a sign that that's a main proposition. And then finally, the section headings or the book chapter titles might be a clue. Not always, again, but just generally. The best thing you can do to understand what the main propositions of the argument are is just to read through the thing once and then think about it. You have to get to the end, in other words, to really identify it. Because as you're reading the article, it's easy to get lost in the details, right? So sometimes you may want to just hold off on identifying the main propositions until after you've finished the entire book or the entire article, and then you can more easily identify them. Let me show you some more examples on the next slide. Another thing you can look for is language that whenever the author says something like, here are two things that do X or impact Y. For example, on page 29 of the Kamens article, you have this passage here about populist movements have two major complaints about modern nation states, blah, blah, blah. That's basically, I didn't even need to include the whole quote, just that very first sentence. Kind of tells you by the wording, should make you sit up and take notice. This is providing a detail to support a proposition. And so that's a clue that this is one of the primary propositions. Populist movements have two major complaints about modern nation states, and this is what they are. So that's a little detail. That's not the proposition itself, but that's a detail that is supporting the proposition. So when you see something like this, go ahead and look at why is the author including that as an example? What's their point there? What is the point that is supposed to be reinforcing? And then that's their main proposition, okay? I'll show you another example. Okay, here's another example along those same lines. This one comes on page 26. For example, the author's giving an example. The historic adversaries of populists in the U.S. were economic elites and their supporters in the political system. Economic monopolies sanctioned by governments like banks and railroads, those were the main targets. Midwestern populists focused their anger on these targets and the Eastern elites who confronted them. These movements were reformist in intent and optimistic in tone. So here's an example that you could notice because it says, for example, of something, that this may be in support of the main proposition. Now, the example itself is probably not the main proposition. The example is in support of the main proposition. In this case, the example is illustrating one of their key points about how populist movements of today are different from populist movements in the past. Okay, so that's one of their key points. So it's important to remember that it's not the example that is the proposition, but usually the example is pointing you to the proposition. Ask yourself, why is the author providing me an example here? What is it that they're trying to get me to understand? In this case, it's the difference between populist movements in the past and populist movements today. Okay, so why do we spend all of this time identifying the main propositions of an argument? Why is it worth it to do that? The reason it's worth it to do that is because this is how you can agree or disagree with an argument. Okay, one of the main ways to agree or disagree with an argument is to agree or disagree with the main propositions of the argument. So to explain more what I mean, let's go to the classic example of a basic argument, right? You've all probably heard this before. 1, Socrates is a man. 2, all men are mortal. 3, conclusion, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay, so all three of these things are a proposition. Remember I said propositions are not just the middle parts of how you get to an argument, they are also the conclusion, and also even the beginning too. The statement of the problem can be a proposition. So all three of these things are a proposition. The logic is that 1 + 2 = 3, right? So if you were going to disagree with this argument, the first way you could go about doing so is by disagreeing with each or both propositions. Maybe I want to disagree and say Socrates is not a man. He might be an AI-generated holograph, in which case, there you go. Or maybe I want to disagree with proposition number 2, that all men are mortal. Maybe not. Maybe some men are gods, in which case they're not mortal, and in which case that deflates the entire argument there. So that's one of the main ways to disagree with an argument, and that's why we put so much emphasis on identifying the main propositions of the argument so that you can agree or disagree with those propositions. Now, there is another way to agree or disagree with the argument, and that's what I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So that's where we get into assumptions. Okay, so the second way to agree or disagree with an argument is to challenge the assumptions of an argument. Now, assumptions are just things that are left unsaid. And the important thing to remember about them is that they're not necessarily always bad. Some assumptions are good, and they're just used as shortcuts so that you're not having the same conversation over and over again, right? So an assumption is not necessarily bad, but it is something that you want to be aware of. Because if you disagree with some of the assumptions of an argument, that is also a good way to challenge that argument, all right? So 2 ways to challenge an argument. 1, disagree with one or more of the propositions. Or 2, sorry, this is still part of 1, you can disagree with the logical connector. I forgot to say that on the previous slide. You could disagree that 1 plus 2 equals 3. Maybe the propositions are not connected in the way that the author is saying that they are. So you can disagree with either the veracity of the propositions themselves or by the logical connection between the 2 propositions, or you can disagree with some of the assumptions that the argument is built off of. Those are the 2 primary ways to agree or disagree with an argument. Okay, let's think about what are the assumptions in Kamens' article and their argument. What if I put this statement on the board? Populism is anti-democratic, period. We know it's a proposition, right? It's a statement or a claim being made. And it does seem to be something that Kamens is making in this article. It's a statement. But the question is this an assumption? The answer is no. The reason why it's not an assumption is because assumptions, remember, are things that the author leaves unsaid. Kamens spends a lot of time talking about this and trying to convince you of the truth of it. So if that's the case, then you know that it's not an assumption. It's a part of the proposition of how they're building their argument. Another thing you can look to see whether something is an assumption or not is the author offering a lot of evidence in support of that statement or claim? Because if they are, then it's not an assumption. So in this case, populism is anti-democratic is not something that Kamens is assuming that you already agree with. It's something that they're trying to convince you of, and they're trying to demonstrate. So it is a main part of their argument. Okay? Okay, so here's 2 assumptions that do exist in Kamens' article. Number 1, science and rationality are good things and are better sources for guiding government than are things like superstition or religious-based knowledge. That's an assumption. 2, democracy is good and desirable, and it's better to have a democracy than rule by the strongest, biggest / most powerful things. Those are 2 assumptions of this argument. Notice the author does not spend a lot of time talking about, for example, the ways that science and rationality can be misleading or incomplete, or even false, for example. Nor do they spend a lot of time comparing the benefits of democracies with autocracies and trying to convince you why one is better than the other. These are things that are going unsaid, and that's perfectly fine. If you don't want to have a conversation about whether democracy is better than autocracy, it's perfectly fine to take that as an assumption that, yeah, okay, I think we're all agreed that democracy is better. That's a perfectly fine argument to have, a perfectly fine assumption to include in your argument. Okay, so remember how I said there's 2 ways to disagree with an argument. 1 is by challenging one or more of the propositions and or the logical connection between those propositions, and 2 is by challenging the assumptions of the article. So if you wanted to disagree with this article, you could argue that, other forms of knowledge might be better, more effective for building governments off of, or that autocracies are, more stable. They're not, but, you see, you have to back it up by evidence. Or you could say that autocracies are more efficient, or they're better at decision making, or something like that. If you wanted to challenge the assumptions of an argument, that would be fine too. So those are the 2 ways to challenge arguments in political science.